Good morning. Good morning to all y'all too. Alrighty, I'm back. Just to be on the safe side, I'm wearing KN95, which is higher level of coverage. But my understanding is in no way, shape, or form should I be contagious. So that's the only reason I'm back on campus. Otherwise, I would have stayed home to protect y'all. So I have a group activity for y'all to do today, but I was really sort of counting on, more people being here. So let's go ahead and dive into our lecture, and hopefully some people will filter in. And if not, then we'll do it Wednesday when hopefully more people will come. I'm getting the impression some people are starting to think that watching the videos later is a good substitute for class, which we're going to have a lot more activities that we'll be doing. So not really. Good morning. So, please, for anyone who's watching this afterwards, or kudos to y'all who are here, please do attend class. Especially in this class, we're going to continue to be really interactive. And you will get points if you're here, miss points if you're not. So, yeehaw. All right. Well, if that's the case, let's go ahead and work on the lecture for today. So let me go ahead and share screen. We do have some video clips today, so I'll share sound as well. Okay. Zoom thing, I don't need you. All right. Here. I will cut you. Not really. I will not be violent to Zoom, I promise. All right. Okay, there we go. Awesome. All right, so we're going to start talking about understanding the numbers, and then hopefully we'll have enough people here on Wednesday to do the fun activity, which is looking at logical fallacies and biases. So, I mean, I could probably do it, but someone might end up in a group by themselves, and I don't like to do that to people. So, so that'll actually help. I think most of you have it already, but come Wednesday with some sort of device you can use, whether it's your phone or your laptop, because I designed this thinking I would still be stuck at home. So it's actually going to ask you to look stuff up online. So cool. Well, again, kudos to all of you who are here. Thank you. I appreciate it. And we're going to talk about understanding the numbers. And I know some of you have already done the perusal for this. I went through and I caught up on all the perusals and all your assignments for this class. So your grades are pretty up to date now for this class. So I really enjoy going through, looking at the conversations y'all are having, which is fantastic. And just kind of keeping in mind where we're at with things. So this week we'll be doing understanding the numbers all week. And then next Monday we don't have class because it's fall break, believe it or not. It's the first time, I think, in a really long time where my husband and I actually both have the same day off. So that's exciting. Other people may be running into that with family members since it's Indigenous Peoples Day. So, and then the following week, we'll talk about what the numbers tell you. So the next chapter sort of follows from this. How do we interpret numbers? And then we will have the exam 2 weeks from today. And it'll be really similar in format to the last one. It'll just be in class. So we won't have to be typing things into little boxes, which I know for some people, it's harder to process things that way. So let's go ahead and dive in. So let me move our little floaty box out of the way here. All right, so when you just hear the word numbers, what do y'all think of? Math, okay. What's that? Counting, yeah.
I think it was a little pretty magnets. They're really colorful magnets.
those will be letters, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, that, this might be something that you do in a visual way, right? How about feelings? Like if I said numbers, or if I said, we're gonna have to do math in this class, how would y'all feel? It's all thumbs down right away. Yeah, a couple thumbs down. Right? To be perfectly honest, and some of you may have figured this out already, one of the reasons we now have this class required instead of psych stats is because of how many people would freak out about it. And like, our job is not to cause you anxiety, especially if you're never going to go to a grad school where you're going to be using that information in a research way, right? If you are thinking you want to do a PhD or a research-based master's, certainly you should look into taking math stats. And maybe ponder doing the 480 route, which you can do with the BA or the BS in psych. But we realize that many of our students are not going that route, right? Many of our students leave here and find jobs right away, typically with like nonprofits or other organizations where they don't need those stats, right? And I think we were kind of turning some people away from our major unintentionally with that. So one of the reasons we now have this course is A, as I've told you already, we want to make you critical thinkers and be able to digest this information, but B, because of that immediate thumbs down we saw from all of you when I asked how you feel about math, right? Okay, so we already talked about some of the examples we hear, but can you think of examples of why, like, you would freak out if you had to take psych stats? Like, what in your history makes you like, oh?
I like math, like I was one of the science math people, but like when it comes to like psychology, even in my CJ class, like finding p values and stuff. Like we would do delta in my criminology class, all that stuff.
Sure.
Like after all the research, putting all the percentages.
Yeah. If you're someone who really resonates with the pure math, right, then stats could be a little for you. Yeah, Aaron.
And then, like, I remember this class or your other class that asked like that. But like, you can help, like, say,
Oh.
its own math.
Oh yeah.
I don't have any over like, wow.
Yeah, that was probably a suspect because I am making you guys do some math in there. Yeah, this happened to me too. So some of you I told the story to. My husband was a math major in undergrad, and then got his degree in education to teach math specifically. And by the time I was in my second semester of grad school, he couldn't help me with my math homework anymore because social scientists and psychologists in particular, we have to come up with our own stats to try to explain the complexities of human behavior. So we do really elaborate models, we do things that allow us to look at things longitudinally, and like people in math just don't learn those because they're not the ones coming up with it. So yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. For a lot of us, I think like high school math was really gross. Like I was always good at math. That didn't mean I enjoyed doing it. Right? I took calc, I took the AP. Have I ever used any of that again? Right? For me, when I did get into psych stats when I was in college, it looks like we got some chats from Will here too. Will says she's thinking of statistics and people use fake criteria to back up their claims. Yeah, that definitely can happen. We're going to talk a lot about that this week. But for me, when I took psych stats, it was like I realized why we did math for the first time, and that feels sort of dumb considering what I'd taken 12 years of math at that point in time, right? More if we count preschool when you start to do some of the basic things like with the magnets or other things, right? But like I was like, oh, this is why we use numbers, right? So it felt a little silly, but for me, it made it resonate. So yeah, I think that a lot of people have a lot of negative connotations, negative experiences, for some people almost traumatic experiences related to numbers, right? And so in this class, like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to make you do any math, but what you will do is learn how to interpret numbers that are thrown in front of you. What does it mean when someone says this percentage of that, or the mean was this? So taking a step back from, again, like the potential I don't mean to like minimize PTSD or anything like that, so I don't like to use trauma, but potential negative experiences that we have in our history with math. But just in our day-to-day lives, how do we encounter numbers? How do we run into this type of stuff? Yeah, over. Money, yeah. Time, yeah, yeah. I think for some of us, try to do like accounting for like department stuff, right? So it was, I had an accounting professor here once tell me that he didn't bother to pay attention which account he took things out of for his department because I always took it out of a different department anyway. We have a totally new, yeah, for a really long time, our finance department was not good. We have a totally new staff in there now, and they're much, much, much better, but it used to be no one could tell you like what was in your account. Gee, right, we had some financial problems, right? But yeah, and like those things are really important. And you know, when you go to pay for something, do I have the money in my account, right? I've had to learn about numbers in a different way because now that I actually like have a grown-up job and I'm making, you know, like money I can live off of, we're trying to start saving more for retirement. And so we work with a financial planner. And the first time he started telling us about stocks and the market, I was like, oh, what, huh? Right? And now we've been working with him for several years, so I get it more. But yeah, you know, we encounter them in ways mostly related to money, I would say, right? And so why are we going to talk about stats? I thought this video was kind of a nice introduction talking about the applicability, there we go, of stats to our lives.
So in high school, I never even heard of statistics. And I knew I liked math, and I knew I liked science.
In high school, I went to a conservatory for music. I was a viola performance major.
When I started college, I was taking a bunch of math and economics classes. And then in my junior year, I took a probability and statistics class.
I remember sitting there in the classroom thinking, wow, this is a really interesting problem, and he's using statistics and probability theory to try to solve it.
Statistics is amazing because it has many diverse applications, from search results on Google or Bing to recommendations on what you should be shopping for on Amazon.
If you're watching a YouTube video and at the end you get recommendations for other videos, statistics were used to give you those recommendations.
I've seen statistics in ice skating, I've seen statistics in agriculture. I mean, I've seen statistics in climate control. I mean, statistics can actually be anything that you like, anything that you enjoy, anything that you want to do, anything that you're passionate about, you can, take statistics and it fits.
I'm very lucky to get to use statistics to answer some of the questions that I think are the most important questions about social justice and human rights violations. And on my best days, I get to spend the majority of my day doing data analysis to answer questions for the United Nations, to contribute evidence to war crimes trials.
As a part of my PhD, I created a statistical software package, and Google emails me every time someone uses it. And people have used it to analyze DNA and find genes that are related to cancer.
It's even used in the food pyramid. You know what I mean? When we come up with suggestions, of what you should eat and how much of it you should eat, we try those things using statistics.
Statistics is critical for everybody entering the workforce because so much of industry and government and everything today is data-driven.
Just like it's important that we all know how to read, we all need to know statistics.
Look around you. Everywhere you are, there's data, there's information.
Whatever your passions are, statistics will be involved.
We're producing so much data these days. Regardless of the field that you pursue, whether it is astronomy, criminal justice, or medicine, going forward, you've got to know statistics.
So I really liked that because it kind of showed it is in every field. Now, do you need to know how to do statistics? Unless you're going to be a data analyst or a researcher, probably not. But you do need to know what they mean. If someone were to hand you, a marketing report or a report that gives you overall statistics for, the company for that quarter, right? Or for demographics, right? You just need to know how to interpret those on the fly and see what those are about. Alrighty, so, and again, if you've already read the chapter, don't like spoil it for other people, but if I were to ask you, what are the chances of winning the lottery? What would be your guess? You get 1 in 70 million, yeah. I mean, for me, I just think of it as so like astronomical. I think of like 1 in a billion or something like that, right? Well, your book has this great passage that I actually just copied onto here, and I'll read it for you. So you have a chance of about 1 in 292 million, so sort of between what Oliver and I were saying, essentially. There are also smaller prizes, right? You can win just like $1. Basically, you could win like your next lottery ticket for anyone who's played the lottery, right? People generally have difficulties with numbers of such magnitude because we never really encounter 292 million of anything. I'll try to remember to take some pictures if I can and bring it in. My daughter has this book called How Much is a Million? And it's this little cute little penguin who's trying to figure out how much a million is. And so he goes around and he sees like 100 other penguins. He's like, are you a million? No, right? And they keep going. And at the end, his mom like takes him and shows him the night sky. And she's like, there's a million stars. And so it actually comes with a poster that folds out. And the poster is probably like almost the size of this table. And it's got tiny dots all over it, right? And that's 1 million. And it's like a little mind-boggling, but helps to visualize that, right? So if we think of 292 of those, right? That's, again, overwhelming to think about how they cover this whole floor and go out into the hall, right? But, how can we make this make sense to us, right? So they said, it used to be 1 in 175 million. And so this person did some trying to visualize that. So if you have dollar bills, right? Dollar bills are probably about the size of this remote, right? So imagine putting those end to end to end, right? Just laying them out in a line. And imagine you have 175 million of them. And then one has a gold star on it. That's your winning one, right? And if you lined up the bills, one by one, starting in DC, we're all familiar, pretty close to us, right? And then you send them all the way down to Orlando, just line them end to end to end. But then you could do them all the way over to LA, all the way across the country. And then you could go up to Portland, which, like, if you're not familiar with the West Coast, it's pretty darn long, right? Like, that's a lot further than you might visualize it. And then back to DC. And then you could repeat that entire loop, laying the dollar bills end to end to end to end to end. And so your job would be to select one of those dollar bills at random for the bills that make those 2 loops around the country. And then if you had the one with the gold star, you win, right? So this is a diagram of that loop, right? Sort of almost a parallelogram, not quite. And so, yeah, it's a very, 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 very small chance, right? And yet a lot of people still play the lottery. So why? Why do people still dive into this? Yeah, that's a big thing, right? So gambling in and of itself is addictive. And there are reasons for that. One of them is, let's say you're doing like casino gambling, right? They purposely do casino gambling, like the slot machines, based on reinforcement schedules that we figured out through psychology, make people think they're about to just get rewarded, right? So yeah, that's a big piece of it. Yeah, Devin. That's true too. I mean, the lottery itself, right, does fund schools, and like, what a brilliant thing to do. Again, like maybe exploiting people's gambling addiction, right? But to, get people to, and I mean, I think the vast majority of people who play the lottery only play when the Powerball starts to get up there, right? It might spend like $5 every couple months. But as Casey was saying, there are people who play every day, putting all their money in there, right? And they just truly believe that they're going to be that one in 292 million, right? And then that's great. Let's say you are, right? What happens to lottery winners a bunch of the time? Yeah, you get taxed on it. If you take it all in one lump sum, you get very little of it in perspective. Still a lot of money, right? But just not as much as you would have. Yeah, they get exploited. So again, our financial planner, I don't know why he told us this. We started randomly talking about the lottery, our last meeting. He said he had a couple lottery winners that he's worked with. And it used to be, I think it might still be, in the state of Virginia, as a lottery winner, you have to give them an address that's like listed publicly. And so now he knows, like, get a PO box set up for his clients, right, and all that. But like one of his clients had someone just show up at her house because her address was listed publicly. Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're spot on, Erin. Yeah, this happens to a lot of people. I mean, we see this with like celebrities too, right? Like MC Hammer had to declare bankruptcy, and he's not the only pop star who, I mean, he's sort of hip hop, pop, whatever, right? But he had the dance, so. But he's not the only celebrity who's had to do that. We see that with athletes too, right? Where people just think that that money is going to last longer than it is, right? And they are exploited, and they are taken advantage of. I remember, I'm laughing because it was just so random. While I was in a waiting room once at a doctor's office, like I think like inevitably waiting rooms at doctor's office have HGTV on, right? And one of the shows I watched was called My Lottery Dream House. And I anticipated it would be like giant mansions, but in fact the people were actually buying like reasonably sized homes and like still would have a lot of money left over. And I thought, well, this is a really nice example, right? But yeah, the vast majority of the time we expect people to like buy mansions and kind of splurge it all. And that's what a lot of people do when they start getting money, right? So if you're interested at all in sort of like what happens to people who get a lot of money really quickly, I just watched a documentary last week on Amazon Prime called Lula Rich. And it's about LuLaRoe, the emperor. I'm actually wearing a LuLaRoe dress today, ironically. Bought it before all the sketchy stuff came out. But they're MLM, which is basically a pyramid scheme, right? And they kind of talk about how they did operate as a pyramid scheme, which is illegal, but they encouraged their people to go spend all their money because they saw it as a recruitment tool. Like if you see this lavish lifestyle that people are living, then they're going to want to do it, right? And they do this with like Publishers Clearinghouse, with the lottery too, right? They try to be like, look what could happen to you. The camera really doesn't want to focus on me today. So yeah, obviously, you know, we need to be aware of these chances, and we need to be aware, like it sounds like most of you all are, that right, if you go out and you win the lottery tomorrow, great. Would not recommend stopping your college career, right? You could just pay all your tuition, maybe pay your friend's tuition if you're feeling generous, right? And then, you know, get that degree and figure out what you want to do from there. Like one of the people I actually admire most, despite his abysmal free throw average, was Shaquille O'Neal, because he actually pursued higher degrees. And I mean, I don't know how much he actually works it, but like he got trained to be a sheriff, right? And like actually had a career goal for when he was done. And now he mostly does commentary, which is great, and I'm sure pays well. But just like the idea that, you know, an athlete who's making so much money is still like, no, I value education. I really admire that. Yeah, and we'll talk about the lottery and saying it's improbable but not impossible. Yeah, I think that's a really good point here. So when we're looking at statistics, what's a good one? What are we actually looking for? Well, we want one that's actually going to give us information that helps us understand something, right? Rather than confuse us. I think that a lot of times we look at statistics and we get overwhelmed, right? Our eyes glaze over, it's just too much information. So when we're using statistics, we want them to be able to summarize data, present it in a way that's easy to understand, especially again, if this is stuff we're presenting to the public, right? Obviously, if we're using it in a more like academic sense, right, it's going to be a specific purpose. So when we do statistics for research, basically we're trying to ask a question or hypothesis and then see if our data answered it the way we thought. And that's what statistics allow us to do. So I really like these prompts that your book talks about, right? So when you see statistics, just like with any other material we've been looking at, right? Think about who created it and why. Okay. So, you know, is it some random person on the internet, like you're a snake venom person right from your last exam from the non-venomous snake, right? Who's just trying to get views, basically, right? And clicks. Or is it someone who's trying to mislead or just, again, skew things maybe to their side? Or is it someone who's genuinely trying to like convey information? So let me see if I can real quick Google this. Oh, I snuck it in there. Okay. What is it called? So I don't know if I'll be able to find this quickly. Here we go. Yep, I did. Sweet. So this came out 2 years ago. It's the start of the pandemic. So this is put out by a couple different organizations that focus on eating disorders, which is my area of research. And for years, they've presented data about, you know, the human cost, how many lives are lost, the fact that eating disorders are the most deadly of any psychiatric disorder. And unfortunately, that's not enough to motivate people to make policy changes, to like give money to research, for example. Eating disorders research is very drastically underfunded. There's just not that many sources of funding, for example. And so what they did is they actually looked at, and it's sad they had to do this, but they looked at what is the economic cost. And so their thought was, we live in a capitalistic society. People will care how much money stuff costs. Again, this is not the way they think of things necessarily, but they just thought, how are we going to get lawmakers to listen to us? How are we going to get business people and philanthropists who might give us money for research to listen to us? And so they did this, and there's a giant report about this. You know, so they start with what we think of typically, but things like 1 death every 52 minutes. Right? If you put it in that context, that's a little sobering, right? But here is where they can really start to get at. They estimate $64.7 billion is the yearly economic cost of eating disorders currently. And then the additional loss of well-being per year is another $326.5 billion. Well, how did they come up with it? They actually looked at things like productivity losses. If that person works for a company and they have to be out for 2 months because they go to residential treatment, that person's gonna have to like hire someone else in their place, right? If they're a good ethical company, that person should have some sort of leave, long-term disability, right? They can take for that, so they're still getting paid in some capacity. But then you got to hire someone else to do that work, or you just have loss, right? Informal care. So, you know, the cost of things like your spouse or your parents having to like go to Walgreens to get you stuff, or take time off from their job to take care of you, right? Efficiency losses, and then the health system itself, right? Just the burden of people who are in cardiac arrest or, you know, having giant ulcers, they're vomiting so much, right? Having to go to the ER or their primary care doc. So they think like ER visits are, almost $30 million, inpatient hospitalizations, and then they looked at individuals and families. I really like that they looked at this because not a lot of people think of the families. But when someone has a severe psychiatric illness, your entire family ends up being involved because they don't want you to die, right? They want you to be able to be well. And it can be very difficult to get treatment for eating disorders. Like you can drive your person all over the country trying to find some place that will take them. And most of those places, insurance will only cover X amount of time, so then you're paying out of pocket, you're cashing in your 401k. Meanwhile, you're not at your job, right? As we think about employers, the government itself, and then society. So okay, it's sad, right? It's super sad. We have to think of it this way in order to get people to pay attention, but they figured out like this is the way to get people to pay attention. And now, like I said, they presented this in the midst of the pandemic. So I don't know that anything has really come of it yet, to be honest. Which is unfortunate, but you can kind of understand we're focusing on other things now. But hopefully, as we get back to whatever normal is going to be, right, then we will be able to, use this information as a motivator. But, obviously the pandemic has affected care for people in general. One of the conferences I went to this summer, they try to have people with lived experience present as well as researchers, which I really, really appreciate. And one of the people who presented was the mother of a woman with anorexia. And she just described like how harrowing it was to try to find her daughter care during the pandemic, like driving to hospitals, literally being turned away from the ER because they were like, we don't know how to help her. And like, we're too busy taking care of COVID patients. Right. And meanwhile, her daughter is like starving herself to death, essentially. Right. And so, yeah, all these things intersect, and we see this with mental health care in general, right? We know that more people are experiencing depression, anxiety, understandably, right? Like, I'm perfectly honest with y'all, like, end of my quarantine, I was getting depressed, right? Like, it's really hard, especially when you're used to being around people again, right? To, like, be that isolated. And, I had the good fortune of having my cat and my husband and my daughter. And there are people who had to spend the entire quarantine totally by themselves, right? Like, there's a mental health toll to this as well that we haven't reckoned with, much less the mass grief we're going to reckon with. I think we're approaching 700,000 people who have died in the US from this, right? I think that starts to get into lottery-like numbers where we can't comprehend it, So we're going to have to, at some point, reckon with that. Let's see. Your book also gives an example of pregnancy, homicide, and death rate statistics. And they talk about how like news sources will get a hold of these data, right, and just like misinterpret them and be like, all these pregnant women are being murdered. Oh no. And like, yes, there are cases, especially in cases of domestic violence, where like a pregnancy in theory can actually make things more risky for you, right? But in fact, what we're seeing is like a skew of statistics. So this is really similar to clinical trials for, let's say, medications, vaccines, what have you. So I haven't mentioned this before, but I went to go do a clinical trial for a new medication for one of my conditions I have. And it turns out my condition's just not severe enough to warrant it. So I was like excluded from the trial. But I had to go through their screening process to do that. And one of the things they shared with me, and it was included in their 17-page consent form, was that anything that happens to you while you're part of a clinical trial gets recorded as a possible side effect. So like if were I to leave their office, turn onto the road outside of their office and someone hit me with their car, in my car accidents are a potential side effect. Right? Even though that probably had nothing to do with the fact that I was taking this medication, or in this case not yet, right? But they have to list it. And so this is also why some people have grasped onto the vaccine data, right? And said, oh, well, if you look at the vaccine trials, there were X amount of women who had miscarriages. Well, once they were given the vaccine, who didn't know they were pregnant. Well, what a lot of people don't know, and what honestly I didn't know until a few years ago, is that 1 in 3 pregnancies, or 1 in 3 women will experience a miscarriage at some point in her life. I think it's something like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 pregnancies end in a miscarriage. And so most people don't know that, right? Most people don't know that they're so common. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You could just think you have a really heavy period. Yeah. So it's a miscarriage if it's, 3 weeks in the pregnancy, or I believe up to 11 weeks of pregnancy. I think once you get into the 2nd trimester, it's called a stillbirth. Okay. And yeah, I mean, there's a reason why they tell people not to tell people you're pregnant until 12 weeks. And that's because miscarriage rates are so high. Now, I think there's something problematic about that, because what if you do have a miscarriage and now no one knew you were pregnant and now you have to tell them you were pregnant in order to get support, right? It's a little messed up in my opinion, but I'm a psychologist, so what do I know? So yeah, this is just really common and much more common than we know, right? People don't talk about, people don't want to talk about it. I think about when Chrissy Teigen had her stillbirth. People were like, why is she posting this? She just wants attention. And like some of the best social media posts I saw in reply were, this is why women aren't telling you if this has happened to them, right? Like, because this is how you're reacting. So yeah, the idea that like, this is something that is rare, right? Makes people think, well, if that many happened with the vaccine. Whereas in fact, maybe like 1 or 2 people had an unfortunate reaction to it. But the vast majority were probably going to happen anyway, right? I mean, most of the time it's the body telling you that this would not have been a viable birth, right? So, yeah. Like really being depressing today. I'm sorry. It was not my intention. All right, let's talk more about good statistics and try to give it a positive spin, right? So it's based on actual data, right? You don't want to just make up statistics, and people do this all the time, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. Like, oh, 99% chance that this. Like, I don't know that, right? I'm just saying that, right? So we want to, especially for presenting them in something like a newscast, right? Like, make sure they're based on actual data. We want them to be well defined. We want it to be really clear what these numbers are, where we got those numbers, right? Did this come from a Facebook poll? Did this come from a BuzzFeed quiz? Did this come from a study that was done at an academic institution that had an IRB and all that good stuff, right? Or was it like I talked to 3 people on the street, right? And like late night talk show hosts will do this and it's fun, right? So like person on the street things, and you see people who like don't know the answers to things, and we all like, ho, 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 and then don't imagine ourselves in that scenario, what it would be like, right? But you want to be as clear as possible. You want to explain where you got these numbers. You also want to make sure the stats actually apply to the argument you're making. Right, so, I've had colleagues ask me, oh, do you know any studies about X? And I'll be like, well, here's some studies about this. And they're like, yeah, that's not quite what I'm looking for. I actually need the relationship between these variables, right? Like a friend asked me for articles about feminist therapy. And I was like, you know what, I don't know that much about that. I study feminism as a variable, but like, I haven't ever investigated feminist therapy myself, so I apologize. I don't have anything I can share with you. So you want to make sure, again, that this actually applies, that it's not based on some random group that doesn't generalize, etc. You want it to be measured well. So ideally, we want to be using previously well-created measures, surveys, right, that have some research behind them working, or doing an experiment where everything is controlled as much as we can, right, being as clear and precise as we can. And we also want to make sure that we're not giving this like false sense of precision. So I used pi as an example here, right? Like in the vast majority of situations, just saying 3.14 is what you need for pi, right? But there are people who can name hundreds of digits of pi, which is great and a great memorization tactic, right? But like we don't need that level of precision if we're reporting something to the general public. My experience with this actually comes from, for a while here at Wesleyan, we had hired a person to help us with assessment of our programs. And he was like very well intentioned, but he would do this. He like be like, it is, like 0.0000001 and you're like, all you gotta say is like p is less than 0.001. We're good. Like we don't need that level of precision. But he like tried to make it sound like that made it more special. And it didn't, right? So, and it was so interesting to me because our provost at the time was not someone who had a statistics background. And he was like, we don't need that level of precision. No, we don't, right? So at least he got it. But other people would be taken in by that. Ooh, they must be really smart if they can get to that level, right? This must be really important. We also want to make sure that we use representative samples, okay? If we are, and this is a major problem in psychology and science in general, we are studying in only men, in only white men, right? We're missing a big part of the population. So for years, that is what happened. And then like, take something as simple as the fight or flight reaction, right? We think of that when we think of like panic situations. You're either going to fight back or you're going to book it, right? Well, when they started studying not only women, but female animals, what they discovered is there are actually other ways that people respond to these. And these are things that men and male animals do too, but just like hadn't been revealed until we looked at it in females. For example, there's tend and befriend. So like some people will immediately go to protecting those less fortunate than them. And again, this is not a strictly female thing. They think of like herd animals in the wild. If they're threatened, right, they'll put the young in the middle of a circle. Elephants will do this. Wild horses will do this. And like they have their like back legs ready to kick out at whatever, right? Llamas, one of the most docile creatures. If you put them in charge of sheep instead of a dog, and a coyote comes around, they will trample it to death. Because they have, yeah, I know, right? So like people are starting to use llamas a lot more to care for sheep because they can just live with the sheep all the time. It's not like a dog where you might want to like come in the house at night. And then, the example I think of this is the movie The Blind Side, right? So the football player guy is driving with his host family's son, and they get in an accident, and he puts his arm out to protect the kid from the airbag, right? Which actually injures his arm and like could have harmed his football career, but his instinct was to protect that kid, right? So we didn't discover that until we started looking at things in females. And again, like there's actually a really great book if you're interested in the history of this stuff in psychology called Even the Rat Was White, that talks about how like we didn't study things in people of color until the 70s, I think. Like it was really absurd. And so, we are going to miss important information if we're not using representative samples. And so conclusions that we draw are not going to be accurate for all people. Right now, I think the biggest crisis with this in psychology, and other people would probably disagree with me, but is that we are still looking at the vast majority of time at things in largely heterosexual cisgender samples. We are not looking at LGBTQ plus folks, or if we are, we're like a very small part of our sample. or it's like a really niche study that no one else will read, right? And their experience is different, just like the experience of a person of color in America is different. We know the effects of discrimination, stress on the body, on your mind, right? So by not studying those folks, we're missing out on what are their experiences like and how could we help them and how could we better understand the whole human experience. The other thing that we want to do is try to avoid extraneous variables. If we're doing an experiment, for example, we want to control as much as we can. The example I always give is, let's say we're doing an experiment about memory. We do not want to have, some college students come in at 7 a.m. and some come in at 11 a.m., right? Like, not all, but the vast majority of college students are not going to be that functional at 7 a.m. Certainly I would not have been. I purposely avoided 8 a.m. classes. Full disclosure. I got to grad school and I had them and I was like, oh no. It turned out okay. So you want to, again, try to control for those things. So when I did my dissertation study, I gave people diary studies where the alarm would go off and they had to answer questions throughout the day. I didn't start that alarm until 10 a.m. because I just knew, like, if it was before that, I might miss a large proportion of participants. The example I have up here, I think is really interesting. So a lot of people, when the pandemic started to call back to H1N1. If you remember the swine flu, that's what, 10 years ago now. And they were like, well, let's look at what the data says from that and we could start applying it to COVID. And so one of the reasons why obesity is considered a risk factor for COVID is because it was for H1N1. Well, they did a study and they looked at other variables. And they found if they took into account the amount of time it took to get treatment. So obese people would go to their doctor, say, I have H1N1. It might take them a while to go to their doctor. It might take a while for the doctor to believe them. It might take a while for the doctor to prescribe the proper medication, right? If you took that into account, that relationship disappeared. So it's entirely explained by the fact that there are certain people that the medical profession does not believe when they come to them. Obese people are probably the prime example of this, because if you are obese and you walk into the doctor's office, they assume anything you're coming in with is due to your obesity. Rather than, like, one of my favorite cartoons of this is like someone with like a pole sticking out of them, and they're like, well, maybe you should lose a little weight, right? Like, and it can be that extreme. So again, the fact that people of color, women, those of minoritized genders and sexuality, right, and people who are obese are not taken seriously when they get present, right? That is what affecting the quality of care, and oftentimes instead we're blaming them. Oh, well, if you would just eat healthy, everything would be okay. How about if I got proper care the first time I walked into a doctor's office? Then I'd probably be okay, right? It's a nice little definition of an extraneous variable on here. It's any factor that can affect your research outcome that is not of interest and may not be known to the investigator. And that last part is the hardest part, because, like, you can only take into account so much, right? If I wanted to screen for every variable ever, every time I did research, like, participants would hate me because every survey would be 5 hours long, right? So there's only so much you can take into account. Well, thank you all for being here. Like I said, on Wednesday, come with something so you can look up stuff online, for example. Or is your phone, your laptop, what have you. It's good to see you all again in person. And take care of yourselves. And I know I'll see some of you later today or tomorrow. And if not, I will see you on Wednesday.